Welcome to This Explainer. When we think about the rapid spread of the early Islamic State back in the 7th century, the story usually centers heavily on battles and armies. But today, we're actually going to flip that script. We're diving into the fascinating, highly strategic statecraft that really cemented the borders of this new empire. We're going to see exactly how the pen and the groundbreaking treaties it authored proved to be just as mighty as the sword.
Here is how we're breaking it down today. First, the rise of Islamic diplomacy. Then, we'll look at Fadak, followed by Najran, do a quick comparison of the two, and finally, unpack the massive internal aftermath. All right, Section 1, the rise of Islamic diplomacy, moving from persecution to state building. To really grasp the weight of these treaties, we first have to understand the dramatic shift from the Prophet Muhammad's intense persecution in Makkah to his new role as a political leader in Medina. And when you map out these dates, the sheer speed of this political evolution is honestly shocking. In 622 CE, the Prophet and his followers fled persecution, an event known as the Hijra, finding asylum in Medina. In just a few short years, Muhammad went from a persecuted preacher to the head of a rapidly expanding city-state. By 628 CE, we already see the Fadak Treaty, and by 632, the Najran Treaty. So the big takeaway here is that we absolutely must look beyond the battlefield. Today, we're treating these historic agreements as case studies in early statecraft. The early Islamic State was completely surrounded by diverse tribes and established religions, especially Jewish and Christian communities. For this state to survive, let alone thrive, it couldn't just fight everyone. It had to negotiate, it had to integrate, and it had to build actual legal frameworks for coexistence. Moving to Section 2, Fadak, Peace for Protection. This is the Khaybar Oasis Agreement. So let's talk about Fadak. This was a highly fertile oasis about 2 days' travel north of Medina. In 628 CE, right after the Prophet's military campaign against the nearby Jewish tribes of Khaybar, the Jewish inhabitants of Fadak saw the writing on the wall. The power dynamics had shifted. But rather than gear up for a military conflict, they proactively sought a peace agreement. They agreed to peacefully surrender half of their agricultural land to the Prophet in exchange for peace and state protection. And because this land was handed over without a single sword being swung, it triggered a really specific, highly consequential legal classification. That classification is called fay. According to Islamic jurisprudence based on the Quran, specifically Surah 59:6, property acquired without military force is not divided up among the soldiers like normal war booty. Instead, it becomes fay, property managed directly by the Prophet or the state. Now keep this exact term in the back of your mind. It is absolutely crucial, because the debate over who actually owned this fey property would spark an empire-shaking dispute just a few years down the line. But at the time, Fadak wasn't just a plot of dirt. It was a total economic engine. It was rich with highly productive date palms, making it a huge source of income. This revenue brought immense economic stability to the early Muslim state. It funded vital charitable activities, military expeditions, and even supported the Prophet's own family, who interestingly were legally forbidden from receiving general alms. More than anything, though, it proved that peaceful negotiation could be incredibly lucrative. Okay, Section 3, Najran, Theology and Treaty. Let's look at the Christian delegation. Let's fast forward a bit to around 632 CE, nearing the end of the Prophet's life. A Christian delegation from the southern region of Najran arrives in Medina for direct talks with Muhammad. They dive into these deep theological debates, specifically around the nature of Jesus, and the sources tell us the debate reached an absolute deadlock. Muslims, following the Quran, viewed Jesus as a human prophet, miraculously born, but not divine. The Najrani Christians, understandably, stood firm on their belief in the divinity of Christ. The tension in that room must have been palpable. And when the conversation hit this immovable wall, the Prophet Muhammad proposed a genuinely startling resolution. He recites a newly revealed Quranic verse, challenging the Christian delegation right then and there. It goes, "Come, let us call upon our sons and your sons, our women and your women, ourselves and yourselves. Then let us pray earnestly so as to place the curse of God upon those who lie." This is an intense, high-stakes challenge known as the Mubahala. It was basically a mutual cursing ritual meant to call down divine judgment on whoever was lying. No way around it, that is a heavy proposition. Faced with the threats of a terrifying spiritual curse, the delegation, they blinked. They chose diplomacy. Whether they genuinely respected Muhammad's potential truthfulness or were just intimidated by the rapidly growing power of the Muslims, the delegation backed out of the Muhalla ritual. They chose the pen over the sword. They opted to negotiate a peace treaty with the Prophet, leading to what is arguably the very first treaty of its kind in Muslim history. The core of this new agreement rested on a concept called the jizya. The Christians of Najran agreed to pay an annual tax to the Islamic State. And in return, they weren't forced to convert. They kept their religious autonomy, they governed their own local affairs, and they were entirely exempt from fighting in Muslim military campaigns. Think about how radical this flexibility was compared to other brutal conquests of the 7th century era. It's a brilliant example of pragmatic statecraft, showing how early Islamic diplomacy built a framework for different religious communities to coexist securely.
Section 4. Comparing early Islamic treaties. Fadak versus Nadrak. Let's put these two case studies side by side to really see how early Islamic governance adapted. It's clear they didn't just force a one-size-fits-all approach. The state used completely different economic and legal tools depending on the specific realities on the ground. With the Jewish community of Fadak, the mechanism was the surrender of physical land for protection, which created that fey property. With the Christian community of Najran, it was the payment of a tax for religious autonomy, establishing the jizya system. Both were incredibly sharp diplomatic maneuvers that avoided bloodshed while expanding the state's reach.
Section 5. The internal aftermath, from external peace to internal schism.
All right, now we have to pivot, because right after the Prophet's unexpected death in 632 CE, these brilliant external successes became the direct roots of some serious internal chaos. It is a wild twist of history. The very lands, treaties, and elevated family statuses that were designed to unify and protect the new empire ultimately tore its new leadership apart. The legal mechanics of Fadak, combined with the immense theological weight of the Najran Mubahala, collided head-on with the massive power vacuum left by Muhammad's passing. Let's look at how the Fadak property dispute played out. When Abu Bakr became the first caliph, he seized the Fadak oasis for the state, which kicked off a monumental clash of legal interpretations. On one side, you have the Prophet's daughter, Fatima, and her husband, Ali. They argued Fadak was personally gifted to her by her father while he was alive, or at the very least was her rightful inheritance. On the other side, Caliph Abu Bakr cited a prophetic hadith stating that prophets simply do not leave worldly inheritance, arguing the property had to revert to the state as charity for public welfare. Both sides brought forward complex legal arguments, turning what was once a diplomatic win into a massive crisis of authority. And the Najran Treaty, its Mubahala event, had massive internal consequences too. When the Prophet went out to face the Christians for that cursing ritual, the historical records note he exclusively brought his closest family, Ali, Fatima, and his grandsons Hassan and Hussein. They became known as the Al-Kisa, or the People of the Cloak. Including them as the sole guarantors in such a high-stakes divine ritual elevated their religious rank immensely. So after the Prophet's death, this theological elevation fueled incredibly fierce debates over who held the true spiritual authority to rule next, the elected companions or the Prophet's own household. This all really came to a head during the Prophet's final illness, an event known in the sources as the Tragedy of Thursday, where disputes among his companions actually prevented the Prophet from dictating a final written will. The lack of a clear, agreed-upon succession plan, heavily compounded by the bitter legal fight over Fadak, and the claims of theological supremacy tied to events like the Mubahala, birthed a deep, permanent divide. These intertwined disputes solidified the foundational schism between what we now know today as the Sunni and Shia traditions. Which brings us to the end of our explainer. It's honestly staggering to think about how foreign policy dictates domestic reality. How did the very treaties, these brilliant, pragmatic pen-over-sword negotiations of Fadak and Najran, that were designed entirely to forge peace with external neighbors, ultimately become the exact catalyst for an internal political and spiritual divide that continues to shape our world to this day? I'll leave you to ponder that profound historical irony. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.